perfect timing now that I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Benjamin Kutsyuruba. Did I say it? I mean, I always got butchered my name, so I feel a little bit better, I guess, when I do somebody else's. That's not a good excuse, but anyway, I tried to practice yesterday. He's from, I have his bio here that I would like to also read to you very quickly before I give the microphone to him. Dr. Benjamin, University of Saskatchewan, is an associate professor in educational policy, leadership, and school law as an associate director of social program evaluation group in the Faculty of Education at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And throughout his career, Dr. Kutsyuruba has worked as a teacher, researcher, manager, professor in the field of education in Ukraine and Canada. His research interests include educational policymaking, educational leadership, mentorship and development of teachers, trust, moral agency, and ethical decision-making education, international education, school climate, safety, well-being and flourishing, and educational change, reform, and restructuring. His areas of teaching are educational leadership, school law and policy, educational policy studies, and policymaking in education. Please join me welcome Dr. Benjamin to deliver his keynote speech.
Well, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Thank you, Jihan, for a warm welcome, and it's a pleasure to be here. I also am an associate director of social program evaluation group, which is a research center at Queen's University at the Faculty of Education. I'm originally from Ukraine. I've lived in Canada for close to 20 years now, and my heart is still with that part of the world. I do a lot of research in Ukraine and post-Soviet countries. And you know, as a good keynote would have an activity, and our topic today is trust. So I'm looking for a volunteer for an activity. Do I have any? I was just kidding. First and foremost, I thought, you know, if I do this activity, I don't have an apple. I was trying to find an apple earlier today. I couldn't. And then I'm not very good with bow and arrows, so that would not work. And teaching school law, I know about liability. I wouldn't want to get into trouble. So I thought maybe of another trust activity, and I don't know if you've done this with your kids. We do it all the time, and it gets harder with every year because they get heavier and bigger, and I can't handle. And I wasn't sure how big the auditorium would be and if we would have enough room. So I decided to skip this activity also. You can try this at home, but make sure you have a very trusted person to catch you if you're falling. Because I've seen, I don't know if you've seen a YouTube video where a person walks on the street, comes to somebody and just turns around and falls. And some people catch him and some don't. Well, talking about trust, you need to have trust established before you do something like this. So, for an activity, I thought something very safe. If you could think of a time when you trusted someone or were trusted, think for a couple of seconds. Think back to the time when you were trusted, you felt trusted, or you trusted somebody. And I'd like to spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes with you talking to your neighbor. Introduce yourself to a colleague nearby and take 30 to 40 seconds sharing about this experience. How did you feel? What was it like for you to be trusted or to trust somebody? Okay, let's take a couple of minutes to do that.
Sometimes I don't.
Yeah.
It depends on our previous experience or relationship.
Sure.
So we are friends for 35 years. So we trust each other. Although there are some other small issues, we still trust each other. But there are some friends, we may have a friendship for a while.
Well, maybe 30 more seconds. 30 seconds.
When you meet, but things go and the relationship is
Oh, yeah.
some friendship. He said that the friendship lasted more than 7 years. Usually go.
So, I apologize for interrupting your lively
I
discussion.
heard about that the 7-year-ish.
A pair group somehow turned into the whole
We made
people
it.
group
We
work.
made it.
It's great. So if I can get one volunteer to share briefly without disclosing any confidential information, we're in a trusting environment, but not to that extent. Maybe in a few words, if you chose this to discuss when you trusted someone, how did it make you feel? Maybe one volunteer.
Hi. On behalf of our wonderful table, I would love to share that as educators and leaders, they felt that trust began early on as students, as children, in families, and in classrooms. Oh, thank you. And that they take very seriously the trust that is given to them by their students to help them manage through classes, to be advised on Ph.D. tracks, and that the trust is something that they deeply value as a meaningful trust bridge.
Excellent. Well, teachers are trusted. Are some of the first adults that children trust, who children trust. If you chose to talk about when you were trusted, sorry, we just talked about that, when you trusted someone in your group, can you share briefly, how did it make you feel when you trusted someone?
Anybody? I can bring the microphone. Sure.
Okay.
Just 1 second. You know, we are live on Facebook, that's why.
So basically, a time that I had to put trust in someone is sort of personal. When I went off to undergraduate studies, I was living in a dorm, and I have to have a aide come check on me twice a day. And one time, I had to trust that they would come check on me at the time they said, because I had fallen in the shower and I needed medical attention. So that was the moment I had to put my trust in them, that they would come. And it was very scary, but I obviously managed to get over it, and they did come, so my trust was warranted.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing. Well, the person that I trusted the most, my mom, we're very close. She just passed away a week ago. And I was here in the U.S., so I couldn't go travel and be with her. But we spent a month together last summer, so those memories stay with me. But I remember as a child, I trusted her, and my dad, of course, but I trusted my mom the most because of how it made me feel. How it made me feel secure, certain about things. And so that was the first time when I started thinking about trust. And when I was doing my Ph.D. Dissertation, it wasn't on trust, it was on something totally different. A couple of mentors of mine have come up to me and said, would you like to work on a project with us? And that's how we got connected, and I'll share about them in a moment. One of them actually passed away already, Brian Noonan, a couple of years ago. So that's how I got connected with trust, and I started researching trust. And it's one of those notions that you have in your everyday life, and you think you know what it means, but without actually understanding the specifics of what trust means and what it takes to build and establish and sustain trust, or maybe restore trust if it's broken. That's when I started connecting a lot of my experiences to the research that I was doing. And because my area is educational policy and leadership, I do a lot of work with principals, school principals, and that project was on principalship, Canadian principalship. And we started looking at trust, and the topic for this keynote, when Jihan approached me, I thought it would be perfect for me to share about some of our research, but also some of our learnings, and take it a bit further. So why leadership? Somebody very wise a few centuries ago said that, you know, 3 things are needed for government. And when they talk about government, it's the people with authority: weapons, food, and trust. If a ruler cannot hold to all 3, he or she should first give up weapons. Second, food. And trust should be guarded to the end. Without trust, we cannot stand. So that was Confucius a few centuries back, not 1938. So, why leadership? Why trust and why leadership? And I just scanned through a number of magazines, some from previous years, some from before, and you would see a lot of leadership focus in our society. And these are some of the leaders, and you will see on some magazines, some leaders are described as indecisive. Some are described as very authoritarian, Angela Merkel, and others. So when we talk about leadership, trust is that component that Confucius was talking about, that leaders should not give up because they are placed in they have authority. Now, leadership, by definition, and it's a good colleague of mine, Peter Northouse, that does a lot of leadership studies. He defines leadership as a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. So leader is placed in a place of influence over others, working together to achieve a common goal. That's why trust is important for this goal, for this process as well. Heifetz and Linsky, 2 of the key authors in leadership, they described leadership as a labor of love. At its best, leadership is a labor of love, but as all of us know, and I don't know how much you've discussed this around your tables, seizing these opportunities of showing the labor of love often take heart, and often break heart. And it's not very easy to lead others, especially if it's a distrustful situation in organizations. Now, despite the focus on trust, I've noticed lately a lot of discussion in relation to leadership about the erosion of trust in leadership. And just a few, I'm going to bring up a few snapshots of, just scouring some of the magazines, and I didn't go into the research literature because that's what I'm going to talk about a bit later. But this is the Harvard Business Review, and it says, people trust has declined in business, media, government, and NGOs. That's 2017. And if you're interested, you can look at Edelman's Trust Barometer. They've been analyzing the level of trust. That's in society, society in general. Then there are alarming headlines like why America has a trust problem. Then you can also look at the decline of trust in federal government to handle problems. So you will see from 1997 to 2019 how the trust in both international problems or perceptions to handle international problems and domestic problems have gone to roughly around, from 70, 50 to about 35 and 41. So you can see a gradual decline in American society. And it's not only in American society. Living in Canada, those of you who are from Canada, we have gone through a trust issue with SNC leveling case. And it's an interesting case where the Prime Minister tried to interfere with one of the cabinet members. Now that was called an erosion of trust. Now if you look at British context, with Brexit and all of that, the headlines are why British people don't trust their government anymore and what can be done about it. So there's a lot of erosion of trust around the world. Looking at European data, and I looked at OECD, they have a report on the decline of trust in government or in leadership. And then they talk about why trust is important, because it's necessary to increase the confidence in investors and financial context, but it's also trust is important because of issues like reliability, responsiveness, and openness. And you will see that across the European Union, the levels of trust, so this is education, by the way, only about 68% trust education, but the government is at 43. And that's the median, that's the average across the European countries. Now, not only in government, we see, or in the area of public policy, you see loss of confidence and trust. A couple of other snapshots. The trust crisis in healthcare. The decline of trust in healthcare is going down. You can observe that. But also, Gallup has been recently doing, well, they've been doing it over a long period of time, but recent headlines show that decline in confidence in higher education, and more so with the recent scandal in higher education, and where most of us are in higher education, but also in public schooling, and that was in 2012. The confidence in U.S. public schools are at a new low. And I brought up I don't know if you can see, the most recent 2018 Gallup results that show that fairly low percentage, 29% of people in society trust or have confidence or a great deal or quite a lot in public schools. I couldn't find information like that on Britain or on Canada, but I'm not sure how different they would be because context matters. But it's still, a good colleague of mine, Mike Bottery in Britain, he's written on decline of trust in society's trust in government and in school and government's decline of trust of government in schools as well. And more so because schools are organizations. Decline of trust or lack of trust in leadership becomes an issue that affects performance in organizations, whether it's performance towards school improvement or performance of teachers. And if you look at the bottom there, it says 45% of people say lack of trust in leadership is the biggest issue impacting their work performance. That's quite high. So why I think I've made the case or a rationale of the importance for trust in organizations. And today's presentation, I want to focus on the life cycle of trust, what we call, with our colleagues, life cycle of trust. And it's looking at stages of trust, namely establishing, maintaining, sustaining, breaking, and restoring trust. And we'll try to tackle each of these. I'll ask this question to you. Imagine mentally taking apart a bike. So you can imagine how you take apart a bike. Can you? No? Well, you use some tools and take it apart. Now, you've taken apart the bike. Now, mentally put it back together. Is it easier? Or is it more difficult? More difficult. Okay. Now, I'll ask you to mentally again, don't do this at home, take apart a frog. Would you do that? No. Would you be able to put it back together if you decided to mentally do it? No. Why is it? Because it's a living organism. It's an ecosystem. In our research, we use this ecological perspective of trust that looks at schools as living and breathing ecosystems. They're not mechanically, or organizations to be mechanically constructed and attuned. They're consisting, they are meta living organisms. They consist of smaller ecosystems. And that's why trust is vital to the health of the living system. It becomes an anti-toxin, or a health-giving ingredient for good and excellent goodwill and excellent working and learning experiences. That's why in our work, we look at lifecycle of trust, how trust is built, brokered, bolstered, or increased, as well as breached, broken, and betrayed. And we do that by looking at relational dynamics, how relationships contribute to establishing, maintaining, sustaining, breaking, and restoring trust. So what is trust? I'm a linguist to start with. I did my undergraduate degrees in English as a second language and linguistics. So I always go back to the meaning, trying to take apart the word. So if I were to ask you, in a few words, to define trust, something very easy, something that you deal with on an everyday basis, in a few words, what is trust?
Believe in someone.
Okay, belief in someone.
Confidence that they will do it.
That they will do it. Okay.
Security.
Reliability.
Reliability, security.
Security. So these are just descriptors of trust. Definitionally, trust the notion of trust is very complicated, and I hope I will demonstrate it by our definition. That we looked at a number of different research aspects of trust, and we tried to bring it together because there's no agreement about what trust is. We can understand different descriptors of trust, like reliability and so on. So we've come to, through our research, and we've done this research for about 15 years now, we've come to understand trust as an extent to which one engages in a reciprocal interaction and a relationship in such a way that there is willingness to be vulnerable and to another and to assume risk with some possible expectation, with positive expectations and a degree of confidence that the other person or the other party will possess some semblance of benevolence, that's goodwill, care, competence, honesty, openness, reliability, hope, respect, and wisdom. Very loaded definition. Definitely something that, not a definition that you would teach to your kids when you teach them about trust. Yes?
Well, I kid you not, when you gave the definition, guess what I thought of? The institution of marriage, because there are a lot of their own in here.
Excellent.
Yeah, and it's reciprocal, and a lot of the descriptors.
Thank you for that. And if you didn't hear, what was shared is that it's in the description. It's a description of marriage as an institution. There are a lot of those components present. Thank you. Trust is if there's no vulnerability or risk, there's no need for trust. And if you look on that, I don't know if you can. Yeah, you should be able to read that. If trust didn't require risk, it wouldn't be trust. And without trust, fear is the only possibility. Trust, if there's no vulnerability, there's no need for trust. And whoever trusts always recognizes that there is a potential for betrayal or broken trust and harm from another. And this fragile nature of trust is caused by uncertainty or lack of reliability or lack of confidence, so to say. I don't know if you've read this book. If you haven't, you should have it on your list. It's the book by Stephen Covey, and it's called The Speed of Trust. And I'll just let you read this quote for a minute. they use the metaphor of speed. That trust can build relationships, but it can also be broken very, very fast. And that's, I wanted to show you a video, hopefully it'll work, about the speed of trust. So, the speed of trust. So, taking apart the notion of trust, researchers and another good colleague of ours, Megan Chen-Moran, has written quite extensively on facets of trust and trust. So, their researchers recognize 5 aspects or 5 facets of trust. One is benevolence, confidence that one's well-being or something one cares about will be protected by the trusted person. That's goodwill, benevolence. Reliability or care, benevolence or care. Reliability is the extent to which one can count on another to come through in what is needed. So some of you mentioned reliability in your descriptors. Competence. You can be reliable, but without being competent. And so trust requires that facet of the ability to perform a task as expected according to appropriate standards. And honesty. Honesty brings in the moral character and the moral aspect into the notion of trust, because somebody can be reliable, but and competent, but not necessarily bringing in moral aspects or virtuous attributes of integrity, truthfulness, and authenticity. And the last one is openness. It's the extent to which relevant information is not withheld in a reciprocal relationship. So trust is built on reciprocity. It's a two-way street. So just what I mentioned, trust is a two-way street. In order to gain trust, one needs to be also willing to trust. Trust is fundamental in our lives, and whether it's marriage, whether it's organizational relationships, whether it's working with colleagues, educating students, bringing up kids. There are 2 metaphors that are used in the literature, and they seem to be paradoxically different. One is the glue. The trust is the glue that binds relationships together. At the same time, trust is also described as lubricant. 2 different substances. I don't know how you can merge the 2 together. But lubricant greases communication and makes cogs of the clock work well, especially when you're in an organizational context. Now, in our research, we've used theories or theoretical frameworks of social psychological perspective of trust that discuss the nature of trust in interpersonal interactions, especially when we're looking at schools, as well as relational trust. And Brick and Schneider have written on the Chicago schools, their research in Chicago schools, the social exchanges around sets of role relationships in schools. So we look at role relationships between the principals and teachers, staff, community members, students. As we try to understand the cultures of trust in organizations. We also look at leaders or school leaders as moral agents. And something that we've grappled with for a number of years, we've tried to merge the 2 aspects, moral agency or ethical decision-making and trust, because trust is so key. But we see principals and school leaders as moral agents, those who judge and make decisions and foster community trust on behalf of others, not only on behalf of themselves, but also on behalf of others. And they become the role models, so to say, of ethical decision making, also within, internally and externally. Now, the study, a lot of this research and a lot of this presentation is based on is, as I mentioned, collaboration between Dr. Brian Moon, who passed away a few years ago, and Keith Walker, who we still work with together, and it's been funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So, the life cycle of trust. With the time left, about 20 minutes, I'd like to take it apart and see how different strategies of building trust and working with trust or understanding different stages of trust may help with how you approach trust building. So, trust, establishing trust is the first and the basic. And, sorry, let me backtrack. It's not a linear relationship. It's not that you go from establishing to restoring through breaking. These stages may occur at different times in your relationships, but understanding them as stages will help understand what strategies and approaches you may use, in this case, for establishing trust. Trust is a time and effort-consuming process. It's not an easy approach or process to build trust. It's a learned behavior. And social relationships are at the core of establishing trust. We learn to trust others as our relationships grow, as our social interactions work. Some trust may come as a result of calculations. I trust this person because of some gain that I may get, or it's convenient to trust this person and not convenient to trust others. Or you trust others from shared values. You very often meet a new person in your that you've never met before, and then you share the same values, and then you start trusting that person because of that. In our research, we found that establishing initial trust required time in cases where principals were placed in the new school. In Canada, we have, in different parts of Canada, we have this policy that every 3 to 5 years, principals have to be moved from schools. I don't know if you have the same policies in American schools. The trust pre-existed, we found that trust pre-existed in relationships where there were positive school climates and somebody comes in and then trust is there. And it may diminish or increase over time. And it's not a constant. In our presentation, somebody mentioned earlier this morning. Somebody mentioned the game of shoots and ladders. Yes, trust is like that. Sometimes you make 2 steps up, and then you're down to the bottom again, back to the square one. And then organizational context, culture, and previous experiences may expedite or slow down the process of trust building. We also found that it was interesting that in our study we found knowledge-based trust. I learned to trust the principal, or teachers learn to trust the principal, students learn to trust the principals. But also we found this notion of provisional trust. The leader usually gets this provisional trust, this trust without boundaries at the beginning. The new person comes into the school and they get this provisional trust. We trust this person as a new leader. And then it's up to us to whether to continue at that level of trust or whether our trust will diminish. Well, we found that this mentality or notion, us versus them, greatly affected or was a major barrier for school leaders. You're principals, we're teachers, or we are parents, not, we're at 2 different levels, and that shouldn't be the case. Now, the next level, it's one way to establish trust. Another step is to maintain trust, and it's not easy. Very often, trust or durability of trust depends on the proximal conditions of support that support it. Whether it's through ongoing communication, leading by example, being authentic, being a transformational leader, and also just expressing, being an ethical person or showing personal integrity. what we found in our research that continuous relationship building process helped maintain trust. And principals could do that through genuine care and authentic interest in those who they worked with. If they were found to be building community of leaders, so if they were the leader of leaders, if they used distributed leadership approaches where they shared their leadership, that built that community of leadership and allowed for them, for others to also have autonomy or independence, but also work with others interdependently. And maintaining trust is just one level up from establishing. But in order to have a long-term trust, you need to be sustaining it. And there are different conditions that will sustain trust, and that's based on research, and I'll share some of the findings from our research. So strategies and mechanisms to preserve and improve trust are very important. And in order to preserve that optimal level of trust, you need to have a culture of trust, what Megan calls vulnerability without anxiety. I can be vulnerable in this culture without being judged or without having this, anxiety, what others will think about me. But literature also talks about this value-added competence of that promotes leaders' trustworthiness. So we're, in other words, we're more likely to have confidence in the well-meaning people who can perform their technical, professional, and people-oriented functions well. So that's how we trust them, because of that value-added competence. What we found in our research is that collaboration and cohesiveness, openness and honesty, peaceful and safe environments, and high professionalism and morale, climate of harmony and happiness all contributed to this culture of trust that helped sustain trust. And essential to this process was shared vision and common purpose in education, shared values. A couple of researchers looked at, they described this culture of trust as a climate of trust or moral community, and others have termed it high trust culture or a demanding culture, where respect, personal regard, integrity, and competence are effectively incorporated along with high pressure and high support. So there's high pressure to do well and be competent and highly, perform at a high level, but also there's high support for principals and leaders to do that. Next one is breaking of trust. And that's why I said it's not a linear relationship. Breaking of trust can happen anytime, but in order to understand what it is, in order to deal with breaking of trust, you need to understand what breaking of trust may look like. Now, I want you to engage in a similar activity, but again, I want you to talk to the same person that you talked about and share about one instance where your trust was broken. How did it make you feel? Another minute.
Just a little brush noise.
Right now, the discussion is going on about the breaking the trust. Dr. Ben has asked the audience to discuss when they had a moment where they break the trust. So that's what's going on right now. We'll be back soon.
Still have to. Sorry to interrupt your lively discussions again. If I could hear a couple of descriptors, how did it make you feel, the breakdown of trust? How did it make you feel?
So two of us had sort of the same experience. It's probably what middle school is all about, when you're trusting your best friend with private information, you know, and then they let that out, and then when it comes full circle back to you and you find out, you feel so hurt and betrayed, and then it's so hard to, you know, get back on the life cycle to build that trust if you ever, you know, trust that person again in the same way. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, hurt and betrayal. Two of the descriptors that are usually associated with breakdown of trust. Any more?
Yeah, and anger.
Anger. Okay. Righteous anger? Sometimes, yeah.
When someone breaches your trust, first you feel very uncomfortable, disappointing, thinking that you should not trust, however you trust somehow to anyone, and it takes a long time to maintain trust, to trust other people.
Excellent, thank you. Now I want to turn this, one more, sure.
I was going to say anger, not anger, what was I going to say? I felt stupid. How can I trust this person when this person was
Yeah, or being upset, you know. Now if I were to ask you, think to a time when you broke someone's trust. I'm not going to ask you to share, okay? And let's be honest, all of us have broken trust at some point in our life, trust of others. How did it make you feel when you broke someone's trust? Guilty? Yeah? Okay.
Maybe happy sometimes?
You want us to really
I don't know. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. No, that's great. But again, it's a two-way. It's a reciprocal process. Sometimes you break trust. Sometimes others break your trust. When leaders break trust, very often they are termed as toxic leaders. And that happens. You know, those who are in the position of authority and leadership often betray the trust of their constituents in highly destructive ways and with some moral indifference. And Lipman Blumen has written on toxic leadership. Toxic leaders act without integrity and engage in various dishonorable behaviors as corruption, hypocrisy, sabotage, and manipulation, as well as some other assorted unethical, illegal, and sometimes criminal acts. They act in abusive ways. But that's also in perception. Very often, because leaders are set at a pedestal or at a different level, they are always at the limelight of the public limelight. And when things happen, when they betray trust, there's more attention to the leaders. And very often, you know, we have to be very careful when we term toxic leadership, because what's perceived toxic is not always toxic, but it's again in the reciprocity and the relational dynamics. Shaw has written on the trust threshold that there's this trust threshold. It's very easy to go from trust to distrust, to pass that threshold, but it's much more difficult to go back from distrust to trust. Causes of breakdown of trust. Some of you have mentioned betrayal, breach of confidentiality, middle school, deception, dishonesty, breach of integrity, corruption, overuse of power, exclusion. We talked in our session earlier today about children's perceptions of exclusion and inclusion. One of the metaphors that I wanted you to kind of keep in your mind for a few minutes is this shattered jars of clay. When you have a beautiful jar of clay, when it falls, it breaks, right? And so that's how trust is. You know, years to earn, seconds to break, and then some have gone even further and say forever to repair. And trust is one of the most expensive things. If you think of how expensive it is when you break something. What are some of the effects of broken trust? Gossip, lying, breach of confidentiality, breach of integrity, damage to civic order, for example, broken promises, deception, stealing ideas, plagiarizing, but also damage to one's sense of identity. Public criticism, accusations, insults, ridiculous insinuations, dishonesty. These are the processes through which the trustworthiness of a leader is thwarted or damaged. However, in our research, we found that there's enduring nature of trust, that minor trust issues do not always create distrust, or they do not harm or influence the levels of trust and the quality of relationships. It is definitely fragile when leaders broke the trust of teachers or students or parents. Mainly it was the breach of confidentiality issue for a lot of our principals. Oh, I said something I should not have said to this parent. Now, they know about this family, and I feel guilty in that. Although it is a difficult and time-consuming task, we were highly encouraged in our findings that the broken trust and low trust situations the principals believed that they could be successfully mediated. That's why the last part of our life cycle of trust focus is restoring. How can you restore broken trust? Mostly, literature talks about honest communication, meticulous reliability, and persuasion over coercion to help rebuild trust. Behavioral consistency, behavioral integrity, delegation of control, communication, demonstration of concern. Those are some of the strategies. Trust is a two-way process. Even trust repair is a two-way process as well. There's always a violator and a victim. That's why I asked the question, how did you feel both ways? For a violator, if the trust repair is to be initiated by the violator, and that's probably the best way to start. A good way to start is there are 4 A's of absolution: admit, apologize, ask, forgiveness, and act or amend. And the victim's response can be refusal, acknowledgement of forgiveness with some unreasonable reparation condition. You should be doing this if you want my trust back, and some reasonable reparation conditions. Let's work at it together, and then we can have our trust back. And then often, that's what my mom used to do, forgiveness without any further acts of reparation. When I broke her trust, mainly as a teenager. There are a couple of models, and we all know that there's, the way out of broken trust or the way to repair trust is not as linear and simple as, a 5-step. It's the same way as, getting into the distrust situation. But a couple of colleagues and researchers have come up with a number of models, and Reina, they've done a lot of work on trust. And they use this 7 steps approach to healing from betrayal. Observe and acknowledge what had happened, allow the feelings to surface, get support, reframe the experience, take responsibility, forgive oneself and the others, and forgiveness provides us with the opportunity to heal our wounds more rapidly, and then reflect on the experience and let it go and move on. Others have, models, maybe this will stick in your mind, repair. Similar, recognize, examine, place it out there, acknowledge, identify, raise the bar of performance, reflect carefully, and repeat the process. So it's like repair with 3 at the end, 3 R's at the end. Again, if you're interested in any of these, we've done analysis of these in some of our writings. But I want you to take you back to that metaphor that I had of broken jars of clay. Trust is broken. But a few years ago, when I was presenting, somebody said, I don't know if you know about this Japanese art of fixing broken pottery with gold. And I said, no, I didn't. It goes so well with my metaphor of broken, shattered clay, jars of clay. So I researched it, and it's an interesting metaphor. They would fix broken pottery with gold, and it becomes beautiful. Although you can see the break lines similar to trust, broken trust, and the scars from broken trust. But if it's done well, you can repair trust, and it will become this beautiful thing of gold, in this case, kintsugi. So something for us to think about, even in those broken trust situations. Things are not as hopeless as it might be. Now, from our research, we've analyzed the data, and we saw these 3 steps. First, there needs to be a volition. Principle shared. You need to have a will and a decision to start the trust restoration process by acknowledging, being authentic, and showing genuine intentions. But also work through communication, being open, honest, truthful, consistent, and regular, and then act. Don't just leave it up, ask for forgiveness and talk about it, but never make any decisions. That's the model that came out of our research. And then I'd like to leave us with 6 imperatives of trust that we also saw in our research. And then hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. In this research, this was like a secondary data analysis paper that we've published in the Leadership Policy in Schools journal. We saw these bigger pictures, but we couldn't understand it through the minute details of all the stages. So when we stepped back, we realized that principles talked about 6 imperatives of trust. One was personal. Trust is biological and psychological requirement, and it's imperative to have that, for developing the character or traits of character and personal trustworthiness like integrity, kindness, care, honesty, reliability, loyalty, respect, and commitment. But also they need to be, this personal imperative gets developed through caring, atmosphere, and attitudes. The next imperative was relational imperative, and relationship building is key component to any of the stages, whether it's developing trust or repairing, maintaining, or sustaining. And then leaders have the responsibility to broker trust, or whether sometimes the teachers do not have that responsibility, but leaders, because there's so much responsibility placed on them and accountability, they need to be brokers of trust, and they can do that through being transparent and accountable. We also saw this decisional imperative. When principals shared their decision making in a distributed leadership way, they actually got more done, and they increased the trustworthiness and trusting judgment of others. But the brunt of the decision-making responsibility was still on the leader, or on the leader's shoulders. Very often they needed to make very unpopular decisions that needed to be done for the collective well-being and in the best interest of children. They were also called to be educational leaders. They're educational leaders. To have trust had the educational imperative. It's a foundation for school effectiveness and improvement, and a lot of literature on school effectiveness and improvement highlights the need for trust for well-functioning professional learning communities, teacher learning, positive educational outcomes, and student learning as well. And because they work in organizations, trust has an organizational imperative, where the levels of trust or distrust in relationships determine a great deal of how professional and organizationally effective that organization will be. And leaders were called to create the organizational culture of trust by means of safe and caring professional working environment. And most importantly, we saw that the leaders were, as moral agents, had this moral imperative to foster trust. They are faced with making decisions that test their integrity and trust quotient with their constituents. And they are ethical and moral role models, or symbolic leaders, or authentic leaders. But they also call to foster hope by maintaining trust. We've done some work on hope as well. And it's not just hope that we will hope things will get better. It's a warranted hope that comes with appropriate strategies to rebuild trust and build hope and instill hope in organizations. So these are some of the articles and chapters that we've written, and if you're interested, I can share. They're all on ResearchGate and academia if you'd like to follow up on some of the references that I shared. And we're also working on the book right now that's called The Lifecycle of Trust. Hopefully next year it'll be out. And with that, I'd like to thank you and leave you all with this quote from one of our principals, participating principals. He said, "Don't give up, work at trust, don't give up." So that despite how hard and time-consuming and effort-consuming it is, don't give up on trust. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me or send me a note on Twitter. And thank you again. I really appreciate your time, the time we can spend together.